This lecture is on political entrepreneurship. Not that I'm a political entrepreneur, but I've written several books on the general subject of it. And so mostly what I'm going to talk about is some of my old research on this. One of the things, one of the very first issues of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, I published an article on political entrepreneurship. And I guess the starting point is you've probably heard of this book before here this week. Somebody probably has mentioned it. If not, I will for the first time, I guess. It's The State by Franz Oppenheimer. And it was Oppenheimer who was known for explaining that there are essentially two ways to make money. One is be an entrepreneur or being engaged in entrepreneurship in the business world and provide consumers with a product that they want in return for money. That's one way to make money. Another way to make money is legalized theft, otherwise known as politics. Be involved as a lobbyist, trying to get the government to pass a law or regulation that robs the treasury for your benefit or harms the competition for your business, that sort of thing. You can make money that way. For example, say you're in the mousetrap business. You're a mousetrap manufacturer. Well, you can make money by manufacturing better quality and or cheaper mousetraps. That's one way to make money. The second way to make money is to lobby Congress to put high tariffs on the importation of foreign mousetraps. That's another way to make money. In the economics literature, the second way of making money is called rent-seeking, which is a very clunky, bad term. I don't like rent-seeking. It's confusing. I prefer plunder-seeking better. It's because that's essentially what you're seeking. You're not seeking rent. Most people think it's what you pay a landlord. And yes, economic rent is different. But this was just an attempt to dress up plunder-seeking with a scientific-sounding word, I guess, rent-seeking. And in fact, one of my old professors, Gordon Tullock, claims to be the originator of that phrase, that idea. And a lot of people thought he should have won the Nobel Prize with James Buchanan over that, but he didn't. But anyway, that's the sort of the subject, the theoretical twist here is to compare entrepreneurship, genuine entrepreneurship. And you've heard Peter Klein give a couple of talks mentioning this, and I know some of you have read about it in the advanced readings. And that's what drives the economy. That's what drives wealth creation, entrepreneurship. And I don't have to give you too many examples of that. But political entrepreneurship is very different. And my argument here is that political entrepreneurship generally destroys wealth. And so we have, even though this word entrepreneurship is used, political entrepreneurship, in general, it destroys wealth. Not in every single instance. You can always think of an exception that proves the rule. You can always find one politician out there somewhere who doesn't fit the mold, but that's usually the exception that proves the rule, that it is true in general. Political entrepreneurship is wealth destroying. And of course, that's how we talk in social science. We talk in generalities. Hans Hoppe usually explains it by saying that, his example is that Germans like sauerkraut better than spaghetti. Although you might find a German who likes spaghetti better than sauerkraut, in general, Germans like sauerkraut better than spaghetti. So I think when we talk about generalizations. And so when you listen to what I have to say, and you think, oh, I can think of the mayor of City X who actually did privatize the water company. Well, yes, you can always think of one example like that. There was a mayor of Jersey City, New Jersey, a few years ago who did a lot of good things. He literally did privatize the Public Works Department in Jersey City, New Jersey. And he was all over television doing good things, but he was like the glaring exception of all the politicians out there. And so rent-seeking, generally, there's a big literature on it, but it's very old. As I said, Franz Oppenheimer wrote about it, and he wrote about history. He wrote about how this, throughout hundreds of years, we've recognized this, that plunder is a way of making money, using the state to plunder your competitors or to plunder consumers. That's generally what it's all about. Okay, and it's wealth destroying. And one example I'll give you of a historical illustration since I've written a good bit on economic history in the past couple of years, is the history of the American railroad industry, because there's just a perfect example. In one book I would recommend, I think everybody ought to read it, who's interested in Austrian economics, and it's by an author who's he's not really an Austrian, he's a historian named Burton Folsom. I'll write this down here. Okay, and it's called The Myth of the Robber Barons. The Myth of the Robber Barons. And there's, 7 or 8 chapters, I guess. Each chapter is on, it's an American history book, American economic history book. Each chapter is on some entrepreneur in American history. John D. Rockefeller, James J. Hill, the railroad entrepreneur, and he distinguishes between market entrepreneurship and political entrepreneurship. So if you're interested in actual American history that illustrates this concept, 2 kinds of entrepreneurship, this is a great little book to read about it. And as far as James J. Hill, I mentioned this man James J. Hill. I picked him out because he built a transcontinental railroad in the United States from the Midwest to California beginning in the 1870s without any kind of governmental subsidy, no land grant, no money, no low interest loan from the government, and he competed against government-sponsored enterprises. They've been in the news a lot lately in terms of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but these were the original government-sponsored enterprises in America. Was the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific Railroads, which were very heavily subsidized by the government beginning during the 1860s. And so here's James J. Hill, this man from Minnesota, who decides to start competing with the U.S. government subsidized railroads. And the government subsidized railroads were given per mile subsidies. They were given vast amounts of land to build the railroads on. And so that's pretty tough competition, to have your competition funded by the government. But he did it anyway. And so what ended up, so he was a real market entrepreneur, a real genuine entrepreneur, and he was competing with political entrepreneurs. And I thought I'd just read you what some of the historians or biographers have had to say about how this worked out. If you read about the Great Northern, that was James J. Hill's railroad line. It was by far the most efficient railroad line. And here's what Burton Folsom says about him. Hill's quest for short routes, low grades, and few curvatures was an obsession. In 1889, Hill conquered the Rocky Mountains by finding the legendary Marias Pass. Lewis and Clark had described a low pass through the Rockies back in 1805, but no one seemed to know whether it really existed or not. Hill wanted the best gradient so much that he hired a man to spend months searching western Montana for this legendary pass. He did in fact find it, and the static hills shortened his route by almost 100 miles. That's the sort of thing he did. He used the best quality rails. He literally was there on the job while they were building his railroad line. He gave away grain and seeds and things to the farmers along the way because he understood that if the farmers did not prosper, neither would his railroad line. What is it going to transport if there's no successful farming going on, in the Midwest? And when he ran into territory that was owned by Indians, American Indians, he paid for right away with livestock or money or whatever they could trade for. And so you contrast this to the government subsidized railroads. Essentially what they did was that when they ran into Indian territory, they called in the United States Army to come in and kill all the Indians, which they pretty much did by 1890. They had killed 60,000 Plains Indians to do that. And that was a way of socializing the cost of building the transcontinental railroad, if you will. But James J. Hill didn't do that. And if you read about the history of this, the government subsidized railroads, I'm not a very good map drawer. Let me get this stuff out of here. But here's, here's a map of the United States. It's kind of like shaped like a turkey. Here's the United States. Okay, and here's the starting point right here. And here's the ending point where there's two X's. Okay, James J. Hill, this is Minnesota. James J. Hill's line was kind of like that, whereas the Transcontinental Railroad, subsidized by government, started out in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and its route was more like this. Like that. And it was. You're not applauding my artwork, are you? But the reason it was like that was that since it was government subsidized, every member of Congress, even in the territories where there weren't congressmen, there were still political representatives from the territories who went to Washington, and because they were about to become states, they said, you can have my vote for the subsidy as long as you put a railroad line down to my district. And so even if there were 10 people living in the district at the time who would ride the railroad, that was the price they would have to pay. And since it was government money, taxpayers' money, and not the money of an entrepreneur spending his own money, it was no problem. And so they literally did make a railroad line. It looked kind of like that, maybe not exactly like that, but there were appendages everywhere based on politics, but not economics. And James J. Hill, of course, it was spending his and his investors' own money. And if they did this, they would bear the burden. They would bear the cost. They would lose the money. They would go bankrupt. Their credit would be destroyed. But with government, failure is success. The worse the government does at anything, the more money it takes to reward itself. So it's actually failure is success with government, economic failure. And also you can read about the government subsidized railroads. The chief engineer was a man named Grenville Dodge, and he was a general during the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln appointed him as a general even though he had no military experience. He was an engineer, but his main job during the American Civil War was to kill Indians and get them out of the way and get of the railroad. So he did that for a few years during the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, he continued doing the same thing. And in fact, after the Civil War, in one of my books, I quote Dodge as recommending to Congress that they make slaves of the Indians and make the Indians dig the beds for the railroad tracks. But the Congress decided to kill the Indians instead of making them slaves, which they did. I have an article coming out in the Independent Review in the fall issue about the Indian Wars. It's called The Real Culture of Violence in the American West. Anyway, here's a passage from Folsom about how Grenville Dodge went about building a government-subsidized railroad line. He said, and I'm quoting, "Since Dodge was in a hurry, he laid track on the ice and snow." Imagine that, building railroad tracks on top of 10 feet of ice. Okay. Naturally, the line had to be rebuilt in the spring. The ice melted, the road tracks collapsed. What was worse, unanticipated spring flooding along the lower fork of the Platte River washed out rails, bridges, and telephone poles, doing at least $50,000 damage the first year. No wonder some observers estimated the actual building cost at almost 3 times what it should have been. But you see, if you're being paid by the mile, by the government, and you build railroad tracks on top of 10 feet of ice and they collapsed, well, you get paid again. You build them again and you get paid again. And so it wasn't uneconomical at all to Grenville Dodge. And of course this politics is primarily what mattered here. If you're in a business like this, government subsidized railroad building, politics is what you're going to pay most attention to, not economics. And another passage that illustrates this is, Folsom talks about how James J. Hill spent his time. He would actually sometimes go out and actually perform physical labor with the workers, not just for a photo op like Obama today would do, or walking the beach in Pensacola, Florida, picking up gobs of oil or something like that. But he wanted. If you read about this, he was trying to figure out: are we really working the most efficient way we can do it? Is there a better way of doing this job here? And what better way to learn that is other than just to do the job? And then you contrast that with what the government-subsidized railroad executives were doing. One of them was named Thomas Durant. And here's another passage from Folsom. In 1866, Thomas Durant wined and dined 150 prominent citizens, including senators, an ambassador, and government bureaucrats, along a completed section of the railroad. He hired an orchestra, a caterer, 6 cooks, a magician, and then Burton Folsom, in parentheses, says, to pull subsidies out of a hat, I guess, and a photographer. For those with ecumenical palates, he served Chinese duck and Roman goose. The more adventurous were offered roast ox and antelope. All could have expensive wine, and for dessert, strawberries, peaches, and cherries. After dinner, some of the men hunted buffalo from their coaches. Durant hoped that all would go back to Washington inclined to repay the Union Pacific for its hospitality. And so that's the kind of management that went on in the government-subsidized railroads, building the roads on top of ice and whining and dining the politicians so that they'll just give you more money to build the road on top of the ice again next winter. And of course, they were all bankrupted. The government-subsidized railroads ended up all being bankrupted, whereas James J. Hill wasn't. And eventually, by the time you get to the 20th century, the very first successful federal antitrust case was against James J. Hill. They sued James J. Hill in the early 20th century. It was the Northern Securities case. One of his companies was called Northern Securities by that point. And so that's a good illustration of what I'm talking about, of real entrepreneurship, market entrepreneurship that is wealth creating. You can imagine all the wealth created by James J. Hill, creating a railroad line to California where American farmers could ship things to the Orient, not only to California, but across the oceans from there. Imagine all the jobs, all the prosperity. It increased the economic vitality of agriculture and so forth, whereas you have the government railroads, massive waste of this sort. Okay, and so that's one example. And one of the economic points about this comparison between market and political entrepreneurship is that consumer sovereignty is always replaced by the political whim. If you're in business to make money in the marketplace, it's the consumer that's really the boss. There's a great passage in Human Action where von Mises calls all of us as consumers, heartless and uncaring, in all but the evil SOBs, everything but that. Because why is that? Well, we do such things as switch from Nike to Adidas sneakers. En masse sometimes, if Adidas offers a great deal. And what do? We might cause massive unemployment at Nike if we do that. So we're heartless and uncaring. All we care about is who will give us the best deal. And if you're in business, that's what you have to pay attention to the heartless and uncaring consumers. Whereas if you're in government and you're running one of these enterprises, you have to pay attention to the whims of Congress or the whims of the legislature, whatever their preferences are. Build a road down to Skunk Guts, Iowa, because if you want my vote, you'll have a line down to my hometown of Skunk Guts, and that's the way it works. Okay. Another good example of a political entrepreneur is Leyland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University. He was a governor of California and a United States senator, and he was in the railroad business also, and he used his political influence to make it illegal for anyone to compete with his railroad in the state of California. So even I could make money in business if I could pass a law prohibiting competition in my state with me. And so, Folsom talks about him too. Folsom talks about Leyland Stanford. The evil Leyland Stanford, I like to call him. And in some cases, if you read the history of this, of course, some of these entrepreneurs were market entrepreneurs at one point in their career, and then became political entrepreneurs later. The whole history of the oil industry is like that. John D. Rockefeller was a market entrepreneur. He made his money essentially by causing the price of all of his products. Refined kerosene was a big product of John D. Rockefeller. Refined oil to go down and down and down for 40 or 50 years, thanks to Standard Oil. And that's basically how he made his money, John D. Rockefeller. But then once you get, and then of course he was sued for that by the government. If you read Dominic Armentano's book, you'll see how the bottom line of what John D. Rockefeller did was to make gasoline, oil, heating oil, kerosene, a tiny, tiny fraction of the price by 1911 of what it is when he started up his company in 1866. That's how he made his money. Made it really, really cheap. And as a result, the government sued him for being a monopoly, even though when they sued him, he had 300 competitors, including Gulf Oil, Sun Oil, and some big companies like that. And so, but then later on, that seems to have been a breaking point. 1911 is the year the government broke up Standard Oil. Who's beeping their horn out there? I have hecklers all the time when I give speeches. But after that, the oil industry itself in America became very interventionist. They started lobbying for all sorts of plunder-seeking laws that helped them at the expense of competition. But Rockefeller himself was almost entirely a pure market entrepreneur during his career, but a lot of his successors weren't. They became political entrepreneurs. Another example of what I'm talking about with political entrepreneurship is I'll talk about another book that I wrote. This is the first book that I wrote. I wrote it on a stone tablet. It was called Underground Government. About 110 years ago, this was published. The subtitle is The Off-Budget Public Sector, and it was co-authored with James Bennett at George Mason University. And what this was a study of this was we were interested in how governments would react to tax revolts. Historically, how did governments react to tax revolts? Because in America, there have been periodic tax revolts where citizens would actually force state legislatures to put limits on taxation and borrowing. The most famous in the last 30 or 40 years was in California in the 1970s, where they placed a limit on how much property taxes could go up. In my state, Maryland, there's a county, the next county over from where I live, has a limit like this, that they said the property tax can only go up by some percentage of what personal income goes up each year. So there's limits like that. There are limits on how much debt can be issued by state and local governments by law. And so in the late 1970s in the United States, there were dozens of states that enacted all sorts of limits on taxing, spending, and borrowing. It was a big tax revolt. That's how Ronald Reagan got elected president. He sort of rode the wave of the anti-tax sentiment, and he was a very eloquent spokesman on television for that. And so, but of course, understanding how government works, I never expected that governments would say, "Okay, the people have spoken, we will obey." That's not how it works. It's usually we're the obeyers. You know, it's the people who are the obeyers, and it's the government who gives the orders. It's sort of unnatural to think of this. But this is sort of the perfectly competitive theory of government, isn't it? That the people express a demand for something, lower taxes, and then the government just faithfully carries that out. That's sort of the perfect competition model applied to government, which a lot of economists and political scientists believe in. I can remember giving a paper on this many years ago at the Public Choice Society meetings, where there was a political scientist from the University of Rochester there who thought the things I was saying was the silliest thing he had ever heard in the world. And one of the things I said was I pointed out that at that time, for the past 30 years in Congress, the re-election rate of incumbents was about 95%. In other words, almost all incumbents always get reelected in Congress. And this guy was sitting in the front row just laughing his head off. And I asked him after I was done with my presentation what was so funny. And then it was his turn. He was giving a presentation also. And he had a mathematical model that predicted that incumbents would always lose. And so how could I be so foolish as to think incumbents would win when his mathematical model proves with math that they would always lose? In other words, perfect competition in politics. But that's the way a lot of people think. But since I brought this up, I just happen to have these statistics that I brought with me. I'm going to use this for my talk later on today too. But this is statistics on the re-election rates in the U.S. Congress. 1964 to 2008, it's kind of small and fuzzy. But if you look at, the average is up in the mid-90s. It's 94% here, my finger is, 98% in 1986. And so since 1964, as far as in the House of Representatives, about 90 to 95% of all the incumbents every year get reelected. Okay. And so, even in 1994, the Republican Revolution, when the Republicans took over the House, still 90% of all incumbents got reelected that year. So there wasn't a huge turnover, anything. And here's the Senate, which is kind of similar. You see at 04 it was 96%, and so it's way up there. And how does this come about? Well, it comes about through political entrepreneurship. There's the Senate over there. I guess I'll try to put it up a little higher. It's another example of the effects of political entrepreneurship. Now, keep in mind, with market entrepreneurship, it's all about catering to the consumer. It's all about giving the consumer what the consumer wants, because that's what competition is about. With political entrepreneurship, we don't have consumers really, we have taxpayers or subjects. But what political entrepreneurship is all about is isolating yourself from being influenced by the subjects, is keeping yourself from having to do anything for the subjects. That's what political entrepreneurs strive to do, and this is a great example of this. Okay, it's just the opposite, exactly the opposite of market entrepreneurship. And so, how do they do this? Well, there are a lot of techniques Congress has used over the years. The most important one is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering. This word is a combination of a 19th century American politician named Eldridge Gerry, Gerry, and salamander. A salamander is a lizard. And I'll draw, here's my map I'll draw a map of Alabama here. There's Alabama. Okay. And now I'll try to draw a salamander. It has a big tail like that, and there's some whiskers there, and there's maybe an eyeball, some legs. That's a salamander. That's also the 10th Congressional District of Alabama. And so what gerrymandering is every 10 years, each state draws the districts that represent members of Congress, or they're represented by a member of Congress. And each state has a certain number of members of Congress based on population. And so whoever happens to be in control of the governor's office, when the census is taken, gets to redraw the congressional districts. And so they'll find a district here that is, say, 90% Republicans. And if the Republicans are in the governor's office, that will be the district. And then there'll be another one up here that might be shaped like this. And then there's one here that might be like this. And they'll be shaped like that because maybe the Democrats are in power, and this one will be 80% Democrats there. That way, whoever runs for election is guaranteed to win and to always win. Because if you're a Democrat and you're in this district right here that is 85% Democrats, it doesn't really matter who the candidate is. The Democrat is always going to win. And the same with this one. If this is 85% Republicans, it doesn't really matter who's going to run. The Republican is always going to win. And so it makes every incumbent's seat safe. And on top of that, the members of Congress all have staff paid for by the taxpayers. And they have dozens of people working for them, and they're essentially full-time campaign staff. So if you're a challenger, you want to challenge an incumbent member of Congress, how can you compete with that? How can you compete with having dozens of people working for you, paid for by the taxpayers? You have to raise money to do that. And then, of course, on top of that, Congress makes the rules, and they instruct the states, really. The states make the rules. The politicians at the state level make the rules regarding political competition. In fact, James Bennett, who I just mentioned, he wrote a book last year on barriers to entry in politics. And from one of the things he told me when he was working on this is he just looked into what it would take if he were to run for Congress in Virginia, where he lives, as a libertarian. And he would need to get 10,000 signatures. But if he were to run as a Republican or a Democrat, he wouldn't need any signatures. And so there are all sorts of barriers to entry into politics like this they're the result of political entrepreneurship that create, the real monopoly problem in America is in government. If you want to worry about monopoly, what better way to create a monopoly is to be the person in power who writes the rules regarding who gets to compete with you. That's what they do. And that's just one of the other things. Congress gets, they get all kinds of money also to spend on essentially campaigning. They call it mail. They call it the franking privilege, free mail. So they get to send out free mail, to everybody in their district constantly. And a third thing is that, the committee system in the legislature. If you're from a farm district, you get yourself on about 24 agricultural committees. And what's the purpose of those committees? It's to dole out taxpayers' monies to farmers, essentially, or to get laws passed that prop up the price of food. And how can a challenger compete with that? It's almost impossible to compete with that sort of thing. And so that's how political entrepreneurship is used to create monopoly power in government. Gerrymandering. Okay. But back to underground government, that's sort of a diversion from my underground government story. In the response to tax revolts, what James Bennett and I found was that the politicians at all levels of government, and this was mostly state and local government in the United States, was to say, okay, the people have spoken, we will not spend more than what the law says now, or we will not borrow more than what the law says, but at the same time, they set up off-budget government enterprises, a whole new array of off-budget government enterprises. And we had a whole chapter on what happened in New York State when Nelson Rockefeller was the governor back in the 1960s. And there was a bit of a tax revolt in New York State because Rockefeller was a big government politician. What Rockefeller politician wasn't a big government politician, But he wanted to pretty much cement over New York State with government projects. He had all kind of grandiose plans to build a state university on every block, and public housing, on top of all the state universities, and of course this was just a huge boon for the cement and the building industry, and so this was gigantic patronage. This was sort of early Obama, with stimulus spending, but it's really patronage jobs under the guise of stimulus spending. And so Rockefeller proposed building public housing, for example, and massive public housing projects, and a lot of state university dormitories and so forth. And the people kept rejecting it. They would have to borrow money. They would have to issue what are called general obligation bonds. And the word general obligation means that the taxpayers are obligated to pay off the bonds. And so, if you're going to issue debt to build roads, sewer lines, and so forth, you issue a 20-year bond, and the taxpayers are obligated to pay off the 20-year bond because it's for their sewer line, it's for their roads, and so forth. And the people, sometimes 3, 4, or 5 times, Rockefeller tried with referenda, and it was turned down 5 times in many cases. And Bennett and I document this in this book. And so what did he do? Did he act like the perfectly competitive model of government would say? No. He hired a bond lawyer named John Mitchell, who ended up being vice president of the United States under Nixon for a while, he was a crook like Nixon, and he had to resign. Not vice president, he was attorney general, John Mitchell. But anyway, John Mitchell invented a new type of bond called the moral obligation bond. And so here's the government doing an immoral thing, and to finance it, they issue bonds called moral obligation bonds. And the legal language was that the taxpayers of New York do not have a legal obligation to pay off the principal and interest on these bonds, but they have a moral obligation. And that was apparently enough for investors, because it was telling investors, wink, wink, we'll come up with the money somehow to pay you your interest and principal on your bonds, even though it wasn't a legal thing. Well, we'll find the money, and it worked. The Wall Street was happy to sell these bonds, and they did, and these went under the general name of revenue bonds, because the argument was made that, well, we're going to build college dormitories, and the rent that is paid will be the source of the revenue to pay off the revenue bonds. And of course, it never worked that way. They never made nearly enough money from the rent on the college dormitories or anything else to pay off the bonds. And then New York State famously went bankrupt, had to be bailed out by the U.S. government in the early 1970s. The whole state was bankrupted by this. The amount of off-budget debt or revenue bond debt was 3 times the amount of debt that had been approved by the taxpayers at that time. And so this was the big calamity that Nelson Rockefeller created. He bankrupted the state of New York. So naturally, Gerald Ford appointed him vice president. He was rewarded for that, because somebody made a lot of money doing all these things. Somebody did. And probably the most colossal catastrophe created by this off-budget spending, and this was all a response to the tax revolt in America, was out in the American Northwest, several states, Oregon, Washington State, Idaho, they were involved they wanted to build 5 nuclear power plants. And so they set up an and the people rejected that. They put up referendum to borrow money to build nuclear power plants, and they kept getting rejected. The voters did not want it. And so they set up an off-budget, off-the-books government agency called WHOOPS. Washington Public Power Supply System. And this ended up defaulting on $2.5 billion in debt. At the time, it was the biggest default in the history of municipal finance. And they built these nuclear power plants kind of like how Grenville Dodge built the Transcontinental Railroad. And James Bennett and I document all this sort of thing, because it was just one big plundering expedition whereby the politicians paid off construction companies to build these things in return for votes and kickbacks, and none of them was finished. They ended up tearing down 4 out of 5 were just torn down after 20 years of this sort of thing. And the waste and the thievery was just monumental, and a $2.5 billion default. And so, and because of this, we wrote this book on the general topic of off-budget spending just at the time this was happening. And we were all over radio and television at the time, this many years ago. But I even remember being in a debate over this with Felix Rohatyn, who was a Wall Street investment banker who sold a lot of these bonds and who owned a lot of these bonds. And it was kind of funny that we were making the case against this, and he was very passionate in favor of this. And this was in Washington, and I remember the moderator of the debate had the best line, better line than I could have come up with, about Felix. He said Felix must own a lot of Whoops bonds. He must have, because he lost all his money on this. But he's still out there. I think Felix Rohatyn is still out there writing up bad ideas in the Wall Street Journal every once in a while. You look them up, you could find them. This was like 20 years ago. So that's an example that I've worked on political entrepreneurship. Being entrepreneurial to do what? To isolate yourself from having to cater to consumers and any kind of consumers, taxpayers, whatever you want to call them. That's generally what governments do. Another example of political entrepreneurship is in another book that I co-authored with Bennett. Was after this one was called Destroying Democracy. Hold your applause, please. Destroying Democracy. And these are on the shelves around here somewhere, but they've probably all been stolen because my books usually get stolen. What this was about was the phenomenon that still exists today. And let me explain why we picked this title. The title, I got the idea for the title from a famous essay that James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10, where he said the whole purpose of the United States Constitution was to constrain the violence of faction. And by that he meant special interest politics. So here's James Madison saying, well, the whole purpose of this Constitution is to minimize plunder. We want to have a government for certain things, but we don't want it to be one big plundering machine. And we hope that this Constitution will minimize the plunder that comes from the natural proclivities of politicians like me, Madison was saying. And so what this book is about is how government not only does not minimize plunder, but it subsidizes plunder. And the book is about the use of tax dollars, how politicians actually write checks to special interest groups and finance their lobbying activities, which they lobby for bigger government. It works. Bigger government means higher taxes, bigger government budgets. They get some of that money, give it back to the lobbyists who lobby for bigger government again. It works, and the circle continues. It's an endless circle. And so not only does government not constrain the violence of faction, it feeds faction. It nourishes faction. That's what government thrives on. Okay? And so we wrote this whole big fat book about this, Destroying Democracy. Every kind of interest group you can imagine, environmentalist groups, labor unions, business groups, welfare state lobbyists. We have a chapter on all of them. And at the time, we all got, we had file cabinets full of Freedom of Information Act data on government grants and who they go to. And so we have all this information on the money, or the government money, who gets it. And then the second part of our research was to find out what are they doing with the money. And Ben and I were both at George Mason at the time, and we hired a bunch of graduate students. All of these interest groups had Washington, D.C. headquarters. And so we sent the graduate students down there to just get information, tell them we're researching what you do. And these people were happy to give the students all kind of paperwork and reports and so forth. And they were bragging what they were doing with the money, and a lot of it was just lobbying for bigger government. And some of it was sort of a subterfuge, because the students we picked were these two guys with long hair and earrings. And back in those days, it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And so all these left-wing groups thought, well, they must be one of us. Look at them there. With long hair, sandals, earrings, tattoos. And so I can still envision these guys. But I think they did finally graduate, too. But I haven't seen them since. And so that's another example of the kind of the research I've done on political entrepreneurship. But again, the whole idea is, it's manufacturing the will of the people. It's not the people express a will and then government responds. That's the classical theory of democracy. The government here is propagandizing and manufacturing the perceived will of the people in order to expand itself and its size and scope. Okay. Another example I'll mention is, so you didn't know I've written all these books. Another one, they all have catchy titles too. The next one is Official Lies. This was also written with James Bennett. And Judge Andrew Napolitano just wrote a book just like this in the past year on government lies. And I was on his online television show a couple months ago, and I reminded him that I wrote the book first, long before he wrote the book on government lying. Of course, if you write a book on government lies, you could probably write one the size of this room. Government. What else does government do but lie about everything? It's sort of most of the people here are too young to remember the Joe Isuzu commercials. Anybody remember that? I know Floyd probably remembers that. But there was back when Isuzu was still in business. I think are they still in business? The automobile company? What's that? GM has them now, so it's now part of the government car company. But anyway, these cars, Isuzus, they had this guy on television, and he just reminded me of the prototypical politician. He would advertise these cars, and he would make just outrageous claims, like, if you buy this car, we will throw in this Caribbean island, and you'll see this beautiful Caribbean island, and then have a big smile, very insincere smile on his face, and that would be the end of the commercial. And it was very entertaining. But that's basically what politicians do. They tell great big lies and smile and stand in front of the American flag, or whatever your country is, your flag. And in this book, Official Lies, I'll give you some examples of what we write about in the book Official Lies. Take the welfare state, for example. What does the government tell us about the welfare state? Well, when the U.S. government issues statistics on income distribution, which they do, how unequal is the income distribution, they do not count welfare benefits, including any cash benefits that welfare recipients get. So you have a low-income person who makes, say, $17,000 a year in income and gets $30,000 a year in government cash and in-kind benefits. That is not counted. It's all that is counted is the $17,000 income. Then at the same time, somebody who makes $60,000 a year and pays $20,000 in tax, they do not subtract the tax. They just count the before tax income. This is the official government statistics. And then they'll put together a table of how unequal the income distribution is and how bad poverty is. And of course, it always makes it look like poverty is much worse than it actually is, and that the income distribution is much more unequal. So, and they change how they do business every once in a while. But at the time we wrote this book, this is exactly what they were doing to skew the data to make the so-called distribution of income look much more unequal than it actually is. And of course, and then we, for example, we had a chapter on energy, the energy industry, and there was a table that explained how as soon as oil was discovered, it was discovered by Indians, but as soon as it was somebody figured out a way to actually do something with oil in the 1860s, the U.S. government began predicting that we're going to run out of oil within 5 years. And we have a table, the Bureau of Mines, the Bureau of the Interior, beginning in the 1860s. 1866 was when John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil Company. And so by 1870, the government is saying there's only 5 more years of this stuff left. And the chart goes all the way up to like the 1970s, quoting government agencies claiming that they know how much oil is in the earth and we're about to run out any minute. And of course, they do that to make the case for the nationalization of oil, essentially, as far as that goes. And you had a talk on environmental policy yesterday. The big news about that today in Time Magazine online is that nobody can find that oil from the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Have you read that? They're in a panic, but over that, it's a disaster. That's the real disaster about that. But and so that's another example of what we write about. Farmers. We have a chapter on farmers, and the government is always advocating intervention in farming in the name of the small family farm. I can remember at the time we were writing this book, they had the actress Sissy Spacek. I don't know if anybody remembers Sissy Spacek, but she played the role in a movie of a farm wife, where the wife of a farmer, and the farm was going out of business, and the whole movie was the poor family farm, and there have been a lot of movies like that. But and so of course Congress brought her in as an expert witness on farming, because she played the role of a farmer's wife on a movie, and so she did. They did, and we quote her testimony and everything. And she was crying. She's an actress, so tears coming down her eyes. And so, but if you look at the actual foreign policy, the big subsidies, the big programs that ladle out lots and lots of money are per acre subsidies. So the large corporate farms that have 500,000 acres somewhere, and they produce vegetables, and then they freeze them and then ship them all over the planet, that's who gets most of the subsidies. It's the big corporations. The small family farm that has 100 acres, they get almost nothing. In fact, the subsidies, since it's so overwhelmingly goes to the large corporate farms, they crowd out the small family farms, because they get the lion's share of the subsidies. So farm policy actually makes it much harder for small family farms to work and to survive, even though it's all done in the name of the small family farm. And then they get stupid actresses like Sissy Spacek to actually participate in this. But what she was participating in was actually harmful to the small family farm that she thought she was defending. And we also have a whole chapter in this book on congressional hearings, and how the Congress lies to everybody about congressional hearings, like the one Sissy Spacek was at. Another one we mentioned there was there was what was the problem? Oh yeah, there was a problem regarding do cell phones cause cancer? About every 3 or 4 years, there's some new report that comes out from somewhere saying that cell phones might cause cancer. And then 6 months later, there'll be another report that says, no, they don't cause cancer. And so, anyway, this was one of these periods where some environmentalist organization said, if you hold that cell phone up to your ear too much, you're going to get cancer of the ear. And so, who was the expert witness Congress brought in? They brought in Jack Klugman, the actor who played a doctor on television. I think it was Dr. Quincy, MD was the name of the show. And one of the episodes of the show was somebody who got cancer, brain cancer, who they thought got from cell phones. And so they literally brought, and he even said, I'm not a doctor, I just play one on television. But they didn't care. Because members of Congress, they hold a lot of hearings at the same time, simultaneously, and so there's competition by the politicians to get the television cameras at their hearing. How are you going to get the television cameras at your hearing and not the other guy's hearing? Well, you bring Hollywood movie stars in. That's what you do. You don't bring experts. Who wants to listen to some boring brain surgeon about this about cancer? They're not interested in that. And then another good example was. They were talking about a government program to subsidize energy for low-income people. So they brought in, there was a boxer named Buster Douglas who won the World Heavyweight Championship, and he held the championship for about 3 months, I think. But they brought him in for some reason, because I guess he was in Baltimore at the time, and he was working with somebody who was subsidizing low-income families for their energy bills. So naturally, he's the world's expert on energy. And so that's the sort of thing. The congressional hearings, they're not fact-finding things. They're propaganda for the most part, and they compete for the cameras, for the television cameras. They already have made up their minds what they're going to do when they hold these hearings. These are not fact-finding things. They've already decided usually what they're going to do, and then they hold the hearings just for to make a circus of it. One other example I'll give of political entrepreneurship, and I'll recommend a book that's not mine. And the author is Fred McChesney. Money for Nothing. It's a Harvard University Press book, and the thesis of the book is that in the economics literature, there are models of economic regulation that have different motivations involved. A lot of regulation comes from regulated industries, for example. They want to use regulation to monopolize their industries. But there's other types of regulation that seems to come not from any lobbying group or any pressure group, but from Congress itself. So McChesney noticed that there are a lot of laws out there that are proposed or regulations for which you can't identify any special interest group that lobbied for the laws. They come right from Capitol Hill. And so he wrote a whole book about this. Well, what's going on here? Why does, why does certain laws come right from Congress without any identifiable interest group? Usually, Congress passes laws in response to somebody demanding or requesting, pressuring, lobbying for this. And essentially, he wrote a whole book published by Harvard University Press about how this is one big legalized extortion racket. And the language that is used in Congress to describe these laws that he's talking about are called milker bills. That's an R. Or juicer bills. A bill is a piece of legislation. Milker. What was milker and juicer? Well, they're milking campaign contributions from corporations. An example he gives is in the early 90s when the Clinton administration was proposing socialized medicine. One of the things they were proposing, as they threw out there, was price controls on pharmaceuticals. Okay? So they said, okay, here we're going to propose putting price controls on pharmaceuticals. $3 million came in from the pharmaceutical industry to the Democratic National Committee, and then Congress said, that's a bad idea, we're not going to do that. And then, and so McChesney gives example after example of this exact thing happening, a special tax on your product. Okay, you're in the, you're a Nabisco and you're manufacturing cookies. And they'll say, well, Americans are too fat because they eat too many cookies. I think it's a good idea to put a special fat tax on cookies. And so Nabisco and all the other companies that make cookies will pour money into Washington, D.C. to the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee for a year and a half, depending on the election cycle. Okay. And then when it gets close enough to the actual election, they'll say, oh, that's a bad idea, we're not going to do that. And so example after example McChesney gives of this, and he's quoting the congressional staffers who run this racket, and they're the ones who call these milker bills or juicer bills. What's a juicer bill? Well, they're trying to juice up the campaign coffers and make them bigger because they need to get their boss reelected. It takes a lot of money for television advertising and things like that to get reelected. And so this book, Money for Nothing, is all about this sort of legalized extortion racket. And it's very entrepreneurial, isn't it? It's political entrepreneurship. But what all of this does is to divert behavior of businesses away from producing goods and services for the benefit of consumers, toward trying to manipulate politics or trying to defend yourself from being the victim of politics. And so that's the opportunity cost, if you will. The opportunity cost is all the production foregone, all the jobs not created, all the products not put on the market, higher prices because there are not as many products on the market. That's the opportunity cost of all this political entrepreneurship in the world. And if you look at my latest article on Mises.org, I just sort of updated something George Reisman did a couple of months ago. George Reisman had an article on Mises.org. I think the title is something like "Laissez-faire is not the cause of the current crisis," and he documented that in the U.S. anyway, we have 9 cabinet departments responsible for regulating all aspects of American business at the presidential level, executive level. We have 73,000 pages in the Federal Register of small print regulations regarding small business, and in addition to that, I added that there are literally hundreds of regulatory agencies. George mentioned a few of them. But if you go on whitehouse.gov, the White House website, it'll brag that there are hundreds, in plural, of regulatory agencies. And so I wrote down just a lot of them. And on top of that, the state governments in America have dozens and dozens of regulatory agencies also that regulate all aspects. And I looked in my article, I just looked up Alabama. If you were to Google list of government regulatory agencies, you'll find it state by state, A through, in Alabama, I think I listed 37 or something like that, different thing. They even regulate opera and child entertainment and things that just, everything you can imagine is regulated and controlled by politics. And so, all of this means that all of this political entrepreneurship is just diverting resources from real entrepreneurship. And so if you can imagine getting rid of all these agencies, just wiping them clean, the unemployment would be zero in America. There'd be so many jobs, nobody would have to worry about looking for a job ever if it weren't for all this. And to finish off on a high note, I'm not going to bother walking to my knapsack, but I'm going to mention this in my other talk in pulling out, well, maybe I will. I have a second here. I have another depressing statistic to show you. If I can find it real quick here. Oh, yeah. This will be the last thing I'll say. It's kind of fuzzy. This is if you want to get rich, work for government. This is about a Bureau of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor statistics. As of 2008, the average federal salary was $119,982, average, compared with $59,000 for the average private sector employee. The average federal employee's benefits add another $40,785, health insurance and everything. The average benefits in the private sector are $9,881. And so that's one of the results of all this. As Murray Rothbard once wrote, when the government employs people and it uses force and coercion to get its money, it can overpay everybody. Why not, Let the good times roll. And here's a good example of that, of where the average federal bureaucrat makes almost exactly double of what the average private sector employee in America makes. And he makes, what is that, more than four times the benefits on top of that. And you see the same kind of thing goes on in the state and local government. And if you want to know the motivation for political entrepreneurship, there you go. That's it. And in my next talk, I'll give you the solution to all our problems. Okay, and time is up.